really here today is not going to be a history lesson. What I'm here to do is to try to inspire you to look up and see some of the clocks that are around in Louisville you may not have recognized, and also to fan the flames for a software that was put together by the library here at Iroquois and is being beta tested, and it's called the Public Clocks of Louisville Scavenger Hunt, where you can actually go around, you can load it onto your phone, and you can go around all the different locations. And I'll have information about that.
We did it.
Good. Glad somebody's doing it.
Oh, now.
That's it. Okay. Well, I thought we'd start with a couple of common questions. First question is always, well, what is a public clock? Is it a tower clock? Is it a post clock? What is it? We're going to look at public clocks under a definition that started being used in the mid-15th century that says that it refers to a clock found in an interior or an exterior that is of a building which is accessible by the public. In the beginning, clocks only had hour hands, and that was about 1400 that the hour hand started on it. Before that, there wasn't really a need for a clock because it was either daytime or nighttime. So, but in around 1400, it became important to start logging hours because time is money, right? In the 1700, clock faces began to appear all across America. They were audible, you could hear them, ringing bells. They were visual, you could see them from blocks and blocks away. And it was two major companies that had a duopoly, monopoly of two companies, was E. Howard and Seth Thomas. You're going to hear me saying those names quite frequently. And in the heyday of from 1870 to about 1930 was the heyday of public clocks. And those two companies, if you look in their ledgers for delivery and installations, those two companies alone installed over 15,000 clocks that could categorize as public clocks. The next question that comes up is, well, how big is a public clock? Well, I want to tell you that Hollywood does you no justice and does not speak the truth in this category. Because you saw movies like Modern Times that was starring Charlie Chaplin, where he actually rode in the gears and went up and down and all around. Well, bad example. Another bad example recently was Hugo, which was an animated story where you ducked under gears and you crawled through gears. Bad story. The only movie that I can really think of offhand is Back to the Future. Because there was a tower clock, they didn't try to make it anything more than a power clock. On this stand here is a Seth Thomas number 4 tower clock. And people ask me a lot, well, how big are tower clocks? How heavy are tower clocks? The heaviest part of that tower clock is the pendulum bob. It weighs about 30 pounds. But you can see it stands on not giant legs. And as we go through, I'm going to show you some others. I also, with me today, have a reprint of an E. Howard catalog that shows all different kinds of mechanisms, and I'll be glad to pass this around for you all to share. Why were there so many tower clocks, or so many public clocks? I'm going to try to remember to use that term. It was because in 1883, we divided into time zones so that there was standard time for the railroads. People had to know what time it was. And at this time, owning a clock was only for those that were that could afford them. Pocket watches were more likely carried by men. Women relied on somebody telling them what time it was. And it wasn't until 1820, which was the first time that Americans owned more clocks than watches. So you had people that went to work, they went to mass, they went to schools startings. They went to all different things, and communities were rung by bells that were driven by public clocks. And that's why there were so many. So where can they be seen? Well, welcome to this presentation. I'm going to give you a clue where a bunch of them can be seen, and also introduce you to that software, the scavenger hunt for the public clocks of Louisville. Well, in Louisville, people say, who owned all the clocks, these public clocks in Louisville? Well, if you take a survey of the public clocks in Louisville, the Archdiocese owned most of them. Because every Catholic church not only had a bell tower, but had a clock. And in fact, so many downtown churches had them, and they were ringing to prayer, they were ringing to start school, they were parochial schools. They rang bells for noontime prayer. They rang bells for schools getting out. They rang bells for the hour of the day. There were so many bells ringing, so much noise going on, that Louisville actually passed an ordinance that said you can ring the bells at 9, at 12, or to call people to worship. So, after 1900, a lot of the labor that was required to maintain public clocks went away because people became more interested in electric clocks and electric winding mechanisms. This mechanism here requires a 40-foot drop to run 8 days. It requires a 30-pound weight to wind. We're going to see some clocks in this presentation in which the winding cranks were rather large, and they had to be wound every day. 450 feet of winding had to be done in a week. So electric time, it became a hard time for the manufacturers of public clocks because they were mostly mechanical, the companies that manufactured them. And then there was the economic crisis of 1930. It was hard on a lot of companies, and by 1940, public clocks manufactured by big companies kind of had their heyday, and they went away. Let's look at some of these public clocks. This is probably the closest public clock that we're all familiar with. This is the Beachmont Post Clock, and it's on the corner of Southern Parkway and Woodland Avenue. It was originally installed in 1999, and it was the Olmsted group that paid for the clock and had it installed. So originally it had the Olmsted Parks logo on it. It was in 2017 that the Beachmont Neighborhood Association took ownership of the clock. They had it restored. The face was changed, so it now has the Beachmont community logo on it, and today it keeps accurate time. So this is the closest one as you go for hunting clocks. One of the bigger clocks in town is at the Union Station, which was originally built in 1896. It's on the corner of 10th and Broadway, or 1000 West Broadway. It was built by the Louisville and Nashville Railroad Company, and originally had a Seth Thomas mechanism in the tower. It had 4 faces. They were Seth Thomas faces. They were 6.5 feet around. They had milk glass in them, and an illumination system was installed so that you could see it at night. A fire on the 3rd floor of this building in 1905 destroyed most of the interior of the train station and the tower. There's an article in the Courier Journal that describes how the clock ticked on boldly until its hands fell to 6. It was so after that fire, it took them 18 months to rebuild the station, and they ordered a different mechanism. They ordered one from E. Howard. So now we've heard those 2 names. That E. Howard clock was installed, but they kept the original Seth Thomas hands so that the visual of it didn't change. That was in 1905, and that clock ran until 1952 and had to be wound once a week until it was electrified. They took out the escape wheel and put in a 1 RPM electric motor so that it ran and didn't need to be wound again. It was in 2014 that clock was then began to be restored. Today, if you go on the scavenger hunt and you go to the Union Station, you'll look up at the tower and you'll see this clock now has 4 separate electrical units that drive those hands. Unfortunately, they're not synchronized. So you will notice that the 4 clocks tell 4 different times. Whether one of them tells the right time or not, you'll have to check your watch. But this is not the only, because in the station, that old E. Howard clock, when the station turned over to TARC and they were taking out all the HVAC system, they were taking all the metal in the building and throwing it on a pile for scrap. A son of a member of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors recognized that it was a mechanism and stored it in his basement for 10 years, at which time it was donated to the local chapter, and with coordination with TARC, a group from that chapter restored that clock movement and put it on display. That was the agreement. TARC built a display for it, and inside the atrium, if you go inside the building, there is a tower clock. It's that old E. Howard number 2 movement. It's a time-only movement. It's driving Seth Thomas replicate hands on one of the original cast iron dials, 6.5 feet around, and it keeps time within 3 minutes a week. So it's currently on display. Traveling into the atrium, there's this dome ceiling has 84 panels, stained glass panels. There's 2 huge round, I think they're 12-foot round stained glass windows at either end. It's being restored historically inside, and it's nice to see that the clock that belongs in that building is in that building and keeping time. So if you do the scavenger hunt, don't just look at the outside.
So was there more than one dial face?
No, inside on the display there's just the one. Now, this movement drove all 4 of the faces of the tower. It went into a cluster that then went out to drive the 4 faces. It's a good question, because the tower clock turns at a certain pace. What does the division between the hour hand and the minute hand is a group of gears that's actually mounted on the face of the public clocks, and that's called the motion works. So you could have one mechanism driving up to 4 different faces, and it does it because it just has to turn a rod that goes to those motion works that actually do the hands.
So the clock face that's in the atrium used to be
Yes, the cast iron part of it used to be up there. The motion works were up there, and all of the clock is restored. It has a 16-foot long pendulum. The pendulum bob for that clock weighs 85 pounds. But it has an automatic winding system that winds it, and if you go inside and ask the lady who's sitting at the visitor center, do you have the key to that clock? She'll pull out the handle that was used to wind that clock once a week. The next clock we're going to look at is at the German Insurance Banking Building. That was built between 1887 and 1888, basically to serve the German immigrants, and during the World War with Germany in 1814, the name was changed to the Liberty Insurance Bank. Today it's called Pasaloms. It's a new event venue, and its tower clock was an E. Howard #1 timed and strike, so it not only kept the time, but it also struck a bell, and it was installed originally in 1888 and since has been electrified. Not all the clocks are up in the air. This is on the corner of the Brown Hotel, is as they said, on the miracle corner when they built the hotel. And it marks the home of the Brown sandwich, the hot brown. This is a 4-dial post clock, and it is a replica of a Seth Thomas. It was made by a company called Electric Time, and it was installed in 1998. But it is a replica of the Seth Thomas clocks. Now, we find these on the street, and during the heyday of public clocks, they were post clocks like this were used for advertisement. They were in front of jewelry stores. They were in front of banks. They were in front of loans. They were in front of all kinds of things. In fact, it was said in Louisville at a time, if you needed to know what time it was, you just stepped outside of the store and looked to the left and looked to the right just to see if the two clocks said the same time. So they were very popular. In the bottom of this clock, you can see is a square base, and that's where the movement would have been. In fact, a number 4 Seth Thomas movement, just like that one standing there. And what they do is they dig a pit, and they would compound the weights so that although it only required 30 pounds to weight, when you crunch it into a small space and it goes around one pulley, around another pulley, down around this pulley, up and around this pulley, down around this pulley, and back up here it ties up. A 5-time compound means that you need a 300-pound weight. And then it would run for a week, but you still had to open the door, go out there and wind it once a week. But I have seen Seth Thomas post clocks with Seth Thomas number 4 movements in them, and the movement can run either 2-faced or 4-face clocks.
Oh, that's a replica. Is the original still?
There are original Seth Thomas 4-face clocks. In fact, I believe that's if you go to the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors, they have one that's out in front of their main building.
But that particular one has
No.
been destroyed, or?
It went on its way. Actually, most of the post clocks were then sold during the war for scrap, or they were hit by a trolley car, or they were run over by a wagon. Once they fell down, the cast iron was tough to repair, and they would let them go. This is an example of the St. Martin Tours Church, which was built in 1854. It's on Shelby Street. That I've always thought you have to do things with the right fenestration. It has to be proportionately right. And even though you have a bunch of bells that are going to ring, you really should have the face of the clock should be proportionate. This tall tower has this little clock like halfway up it. So it's I don't know if it was a visual thing or whether they got a deal where they bought the bells, the mechanism that will throw in a couple of faces and see if you can put them on. But this church is important because it was on election day in 1855 that a bunch of nationalists stormed the church. 22 people were killed, scores were injured because they wanted to prevent the Catholics at this church who from voting. So when we think of voter suppression, you can think of this church, and it was, but it has an E. Howard movement in it, time and strike. So it has bells that it would strike on the hour. Getting back down to earth, there is at Cave Hill Cemetery, which this tower was built in 1848. It's on Baxter Avenue. Most people recognize it when they go by it. I thought of including another clock that is at Cave Hill, but not many people know about. But if you go inside Cave Hill, not too far from this, is a sundial. So if you think they told the hour as well. This happens to be a Seth Thomas time and strike, and it has been electrified, but it still rings the original bell that came with it. It's a 2,000-pound bronze cast bell. This building, see if I can get it to go to the next. This building, people have called many different things, but was originally built as the Louisville Public Warehouse number 4 in 1889. Some people know it as the Belknap Hardware Building because they sold hardware out of it at times. And this clock is interesting. It has been restored and it runs under its own power and keeps time. The faces were set up so that you could see time up and down Main Street and up and down the river. To help keep time and help regulate not only the railroads, but also the steamboats and river traffic. Unfortunately, somebody built a building right next to it, so you can only see 3 of the faces now. So time marches on. But the Belknap building, or this warehouse, this is an E. Howard number 1 movement, which was installed in 1890. And actually know people that have climbed that tower to look at that mechanism, and people that worked on restoring it. This is Louisville City Hall. Louisville City Hall, it was a big deal when they installed this clock because it was supposed to set time and bring all of government of Louisville together under one place. It was, before then you had, well, the clerks were over here and the courts were over there, and but it was a big deal when they voted. There was a big ceremony for it. This is a E. Howard number 4 time and strike movement, and the time part of it has been taken out, but the strike part of it is still striking on the original bells that were installed, and they were. The clock was added 2 years after the building was built, so it was in 1875. This is a building that most people that lived in Louisville all their life are very fond of, the Stuart Strygoods building. It's actually on the historic register, set the standard for department store shopping for many of the Macy's, Penny's, all of the big stores follow the example that was set here. The building after Stewart's closed was then taken over by Hilliard's and Lyons. The original clock that was on the corner was a 3-faced gold clock that had the Stuart Strygoods coat of arms on it. Hilliard's and Lyons tore it off, and they put up a 1,400-pound or 14,000-pound monster. It was a black 3-faced clock with a large bronze bull and bear on the top of it. When it was taken off the building, the crane operator said, "Oh, this weighs a lot more than we thought it was going to." And it did, and it went off to scrap. The clock is shown, the Hilliard's and Lyons clock in this image, and that image, which is not really the best, it shows the replacement. It was in 2015 that the design for the replacement was approved by the Kentucky Historical Board so that it could represent the original, because the building is on the historical register. The exterior had to remain true. So that clock was actually built by electric time and delivered and put up. And the day that it was put up on the side of the building, the parking crew for the hotel across the street, the seal box, was very upset because there was a crane in the middle of their parking place. This is the Courier-Journal Time building. Most people think of the Courier-Journal building as a different building, but this building was originally built as the Customs House, and it's on this corner of 3rd and Green. Green was later named, was changed to Liberty Street during World War I. But the image on the left actually shows a streetcar coming around the corner, and it was an urban streetcar, number 142, I think it is, coming around the corner, and you can see the clock up in the corner. Well, this is a modern picture. That clock is still there. The best way to see it is when you're downtown and you turn on 3rd and you're coming up, you come out of the convention center, you're stopped at that light, you're in the shade. Right across in the corner is that clock. Now, this clock is not a post clock, so you couldn't run the mechanism up through the base of it. Actually, the mechanism is inside the building. And what they did was they put a mechanism inside the building, ran a rod out and into the side of the clock, which drove the motion works for this two-phase clock. It's still there. This building, I think, is still available to lease. If you'd really like to have that clock as part of your collection, you could join it. This is the Courier-Journal-Times building that most people think of, and it's on West Broadway. And it has a large clock. It's often missed because it doesn't have any distinguishing features. It's just up there on the top, these hands going around, and some indicators where 3, 6, 12 would be. But if you'd like to have this clock as part of your collection, last year this building was put on the market. It's $17 million. It's more than what I pay for a clock. This is a clock that I'm going to take a little time to talk about. This is the Parkland Elementary School. It was originally built opened in 1891, and it's on Catalpa Street. And it's recently has been converted into apartments for people who are going to school full time. It's called Family Schoolhouse, and it's if you're a single parent, you're going to school full time, you put some work in, and your rent is paid. So it's a great opportunity for people. The face of this clock, you can see it says, donated by George W. Grant. And Mr. Grant was a character here in Louisville. He was a realtor. But the reason why I'm familiar with this story is because I restored the face of this clock. When they were reconverting that building, they called me and said, hey, can you do something with this face? And I said, sure, let me see what I can do. So this is what the face looked like when I went and took a hold of it. The face says, donated by George W. Grant under like 34 layers of white paint. The hands are actually on the clock, but they were painted white too. So it was in disrepair. The building was empty for a period of time. And there's in the Discover Louisville an illustrated activity guide for exploring the city and county neighborhoods. It says that, speaking of a group of school children, he said, they gazed up at the Richland School, which had been stopped by a tornado strike, as it was the pride of the thriving city of Portland. The school was under construction when the tornado passed through the neighborhood. So this is not the original face that was intended to be in there. The school was damaged by the tornado. It's funny because there's that guy, George W. Grant. Well, he's mentioned in the Greater Louisville tornado of 1890. It says, at Parkland, the tornado displayed its sense of humor by breaking off an iron lamppost and depositing it in George Grant's yard with such gentility that the glass was neither broken nor cracked. There's that name, George W. Grant. Well, when I took on this job, I agreed to do it for whatever I found up in the tower. What I found up in the tower is that movement. Wow. And there's the way I found it. Still sitting on a post behind that dial. Well, I took it down and I restored it. And when I did the research on it, I started to figure out what the story was behind this George W. Grant. Well, I went to the Seth Thomas Order Billing Book, D, which covered 1887 to 1891, and it was ordered January 22nd, 1889 by a company called the U.S. Signal Clock Company, which was at 246 Fifth Street. And it was billed to George W. Grant. Well, the Signal Clock Company was attempting to synchronize all of the clocks at the fire stations and police stations downtown. They failed to demonstrate, and Seth Thomas came to town 3 times in court cases to get paid for the stuff that George W. Grant got on credit. Well, then it comes around to the tornado. The tornado happens, and one of his partners in the Signal Clock Company was a jeweler on Main Street. That's who ordered that dial that says, donated by George W. Grant. So there's where the dial ordered and the Motion Works order came together into one place and sat in this school until I was asked in 2013 to restore the dial and was able to confiscate or barter for the movement. If after the lecture you want to come and look, the serial numbers on it, it stamped the date that it was made, and I'm just thankful to have it. Not all clocks look like they're in a tower or on a pod or something, and if you're doing the scavenger hunt, this is the one that I think will be the toughest to find. I'll give you a clue. It's on top of a billboard. So, and it's an electric clock. It was installed in the 1980s, and it's a Telechron electronic clock. So a Telechron makes a lot of clock motors, and basically what they are is a 1 RPM motor. Rotates one complete revolution every minute. And remember, it's that rotation delivered to the back of the face that the Motion Works do the math to divide the hours and the minutes. So I encourage you to go through and do the scavenger hunt, because those clocks that I covered are all on that scavenger hunt. It's a lot of fun. But there are more clocks in Louisville. How about the old medical building on West Chestnut Street? Yeah, and all of these that you're going to look at, you're going to go, oh yeah. Well, the old medical building is now the home for the Ronald McDonald House. And this is not a Seth Thomas or an E. Howard clock. The original clock was made by Christopher Picard and was installed in the was restored in the mid-1990s. Lincoln Bank and Trust on Market Street. The Lincoln Bank and Trust, this building is now Gillespie's, and it's an entertainment venue. But that clock is not up on the top of the building and not on a post out front. It's over the front door. It's in all the tile work and everything. But it falls into the definition of a public clock because it's on or in a building that is available to the public. How about this clock? I get more questions about this clock
I bet you do.
than any other clock. I'll start by saying, in my mind, this is not a clock. This is an automaton. It's mechanical entertainment. On a regular schedule, it would run racehorses around and people would cheer and do all those things. But the Louisville clock is not really a clock. The only part of it that tells you what time it is, and therefore it falls into the definition of a public clock, is up on top of the grandstand is a Telechron electronic clock. The Louisville clock was installed originally in 1976. It was taken down, it was repaired, they put it back up again year 4th. It broke down. They came one afternoon, tore it all up, and it's in storage, the same place the front of the water tower, the water building is in storage. And there is a group in Louisville that's trying to guilt the city into having it brought back out. This is a street clock, a post clock. It's a modern one. It's on West Main. People walk by it all the time. It's almost hidden in the trees. but people across the street, it's the busiest intersection. I see people are going to the Yum, people are going all around, but it's across from where the Seelbach originally was, which is now part of Whiskey Row, I think, the pizza parlor. And this is on East Liberty Street. This is not a Seth Thomas clock, and this is not an E. Howard clock, but is was made by A.E. Polhan Clock Company of St. Louis, Missouri in 1902. The church itself was built in 1900, and in my research and looking at things, I think the churches and all were built, and they said, we're going to put a clock in here, leave a hole. Or we're building this building, leave a hole. Because it always seemed that the clocks were delivered about 2 years after the building was dedicated. Well, one of the reasons why, I know E. Howard and Seth Thomas both, when you took delivery of a clock, you also had to put up a technician, because he came with the boxes of clock, and he stayed until they were sure that the clock was running accurately and according to what the people desired, that it showed right, the hands went the right way around, all of those things. The Cathedral of the Assumption, this is on 5th Street. Unfortunately, this is another Catholic church that was involved with the riots of Bloody Monday. This church was involved because they busted in the doors and broke the windows and tore up the inside of the church because they were looking for ammunition. They never found any. But this does not have a Seth Thomas or an E. Howard clock. This one actually has a French clock that was made in 1856 by a company called Pin of Paris. Imported clock. Here's another clock I'm asked about all the time, and I include it when I talk about Louisville public clocks because a public clock is either on a building in a building but accessible to the public. This one just happens to be on the other side of the river, but it's accessible to the public. All right. At one time, this was the largest face in the United States. It was in Jersey City, and it was on top of the Colgate plant there. Threatened that it was an advertising sign that did not meet the city codes, they took it down, and 2 years later installed a bigger one. So when they moved it to Louisville, it became the second largest face at its time. You can see the size of the minute hand is sitting on that truck. It says on the minute hand, this is the minute hand from the largest clock. But they moved it here. In the archives at U of L is a picture of women eating their lunch sitting on the hour hand. There are 4 women and they've got their lunch boxes. It's quite a story. And it's registered at 2 different sizes. It's actually 38 feet across, but at night it's 40 feet across because the lights are on the outside of the dial. The Seelbach. In the Seelbach, you have to actually go inside and you have to go into the Rathskeller, as I've been told to say it. It's called the Zodiac clock, and it's up over a doorway, and it's because instead of numbers, it has the sign of the Zodiac. I don't know when the Seelbach allows people to go into the Rathskeller, but the restoration
Should have to go in and see it.
was completed in 1907, and the tiles that are in there is a complete room of these tiles, and it's the only one in existence. So it's a rather historic, fancy place. Just so that you know, the word Rathskeller means council's cellar or German bar in the basement. So, the St. Louis Catholic Church is a church on 6th Street, and it also has an imported clock. Some of the Catholic churches were very consistent in purchasing from Seth Thomas. Others, I don't know why they wanted import clocks. This actually has an English clock that was made by Gillespie and Johnson of England in 1873. And it is a time and strike, and it has an electric automatic winding system, so the mechanism is still maintained. The South Baptist Theological Seminary has a clock, and this is one of the unusual clocks Seth Thomas delivered at number 15. It's a time, strike, and chime. So there are three mechanisms that have to be wound to keep this clock chiming, striking, and on time, all synchronized. But it's on Lexington Avenue, and you can cruise around by it. One of the things, if you're going on the scavenger hunt and you're looking for clocks, if it says tower clock, don't pull up to the front door and read the address, because you won't be able to see the clock. You have to be a little bit away from it. Just to show that the Catholic Church didn't own all the public clocks. This one is actually on a parking garage. It's on the Jewish Hospital parking garage. It's just an electric clock. It's a modern clock that was installed up when the parking garage was built. And now we're going to play. If you've been in Louisville all of your life, do you remember the Whiteside Bakery, which became the Bond Bakery? The thing about this was, before the Colgate clock arrived, this was the largest clock face in Louisville. It was 14 feet across.
Does it exist?
No, these were all lost.
Oh, okay.
The Ackerman Brewery, which occupied a whole block on Main Street. The Walnut Street Baptist Church on 4th and Walnut Street, somebody looked at this and said, wait a minute, there are no trees around. Where's the rest of the neighborhood? This has just happened to be before it. This clock company was in Long Island, New York, and in 1855 installed the original clock into this. Here's another billboard clock on 16th and Hill Street. When I say there were a lot of them in Louisville, now you're getting the idea. They were everywhere because people relied on them. The old post office on 4th Street. This one I include because I have members of my family that comes from here. This is Joseph Brokaw Tower Clock Company of Iowa City, Iowa, built this clock, and it was a time and strike clock that was installed in 1889. And if the buildings disappeared, the clocks usually did too. Now, the important thing about all public clocks is there has to be somebody they call the master of the clock. And the Beechmont clock keeps accurate time and stays on time because it has a master of the clock. As you do the scavenger hunt, you go, that's not the right time. Who's the master of the clock? Who's responsible for keeping it running? That's why the Louisville clock doesn't stay out, because every time it breaks down, who do you call? LG&E. No. But there has to be somebody who's the master of the clock. So this is a Norman Rockwell print, and this guy is eating his lunch and checking the time and ministering to this public clock. So what I wanted to share with you today was an idea of the public clocks. What is a public clock? Go out looking for the public clocks because they may be over doorways, on your way into stores. They could be just about everywhere, on street corners, up on top of schools, and inside or outside, accessible to the public. This Public Clocks of Louisville, if you're not able to scan that little code and you wanted to do it someplace other than on your phone, this happens to be the address of the website that you can download that, and it will have not only a map, it'll have information about the clocks and pictures of the clocks, so you can do that scavenger. All right.
Now, did you not send us across the river to look at a clock in New Albany, or where was that?
Oh,
On the scavenger hunt, there was one on the Second Baptist Church in New Albany, yes.
yeah, that,
Underground Railroad.
I've been in that tower, and it actually has a window in the face of the clock that opened up so that they could look across the river and signal, and there's a tunnel from that
Oh,
church
yeah.
underneath and onto the
It
other
was on your
side.
scavenger hunt. Some of those I didn't see on your scavenger hunt, so we missed several that I guess we didn't know there.
Right. And we're doing the beta testing of the software. So we're believing when we get through to the end of the month that we have a meeting and we scrub it up, we clean it up, we make some corrections. We take in, people have said the map is way too little, things like that. So we're going to make corrections before we turn it loose to all of the library branches to use. So nobody has a tower clock at home. They say, hey, I can't find anybody to fix my tower clock.
I was set on this mental clock.
That's good. Well, I want to thank you all for coming out and being interested in hearing me jabber on for that's great. We come up and look at this clock because it's a very common clock that we're in the post clocks and the street clocks around Louisville.
Did this one actually run the clock that you went up into? This is the mechanism.
Yes. It wasn't running when I got it.
Okay.
No.
And the weight would be wrapped around this drum, right? Cable, and then the weight right below it.
It'll run on 30 pounds as advertised in the catalog. And this is the winding crank for it, the key. So somebody had to climb up into the top of that once a week and wind it up. But Seth Thomas stamped the serial number in it and the date that it was purchased originally by the Signal Clock Company. And
So what is, I don't understand what the green,
this is the pendulum. If you have a clock at home, this is the part that goes tick, tock, tick, tock.
so the small face is just
Right, because
for
if you had,
the person who's the master.
to get into this tower, I had to climb a 30-foot extension ladder, go through a trapdoor, low crawl across this place to where I could stand up to where this clock was. So whoever was winding it every week, he would get there and he'd go, I wonder what time the clock says. Should I make an adjustment? You know, but that's what this face is for. And in every tower clock, there is a timekeeper's face. If you're in the L&M train station and you see that big movement, it has a timekeeper's face. It's on the side of the movement. And that way, you didn't have to have somebody outside to yell at, hey, what time does it say? Because where the mechanism hooks into the drive, there's a finger, and you can loosen it and you can turn it, and that would turn the hands on the outside through the motion works, and then you would lock it back down. You make sure that this is, you loosen the screw in the center, they match, and then you're good to go.
Huh.